Welcome to Terrible Lizards, a podcast about dinosaurs with Dr. David Hone and Izzy Lawrence. On this week's episode of Terrible Lizards, we ask not how big dinosaurs were, but how we know how big they were. Plus, Richard Reddy, that Spanners from the Missed Apex podcast, asks us what would happen if we gave dinosaurs a mulligan. Hello and welcome to Terrible Lizards. On this most exciting of episodes, we are going to talk measuring dinosaurs, or dinosaur size. Not dinosaurs' eyes, but dinosaur size. We're talking about, you get animals which are very big and you get animals which are very small, and you can't always tell, it seems, from the size of their skeleton, surely.
Yes, that is the kind of central point. So it's worth saying that size, and in particular mass, is basically about the most important single thing that determines your biology. If you want to know an awful lot about an animal, knowing how heavy it is will tell you more than just about anything else. Because if you know how big it is, you know how much food it needs, you know how much water it needs. If it's a large animal rather than a bacterium, what kind of area it can cover, what kind of efficiencies. Surface area to volume ratio is massively important for your physiology, and temperature control. We know that on average, big things obviously tend to win competition. You know, if there's a drought,
we are the best.
Yeah, if there's a drought, on the one hand you need more water, but on the other hand, when you get to that dwindling watering hole, if you're the single biggest organism there, you are going to be able to bully all the others out of the way and get that water. So knowing...
But we also did say that although it's an advantage on an individual level, on a species level, being big is rubbish when it comes to surviving a mass extinction event.
Right, and so that's why you get these interesting trade-offs, because of course evolution doesn't make predictions like that, and evolution isn't trying to save a species. If an individual is doing well being big, it will mate more and pass on more genes and have bigger offspring, and size will tend to
That is
increase.
not my experience.
Well... That's a different issue. Right, so things do tend to get bigger over time, though there's a whole raft of complexity that we'll skip over right now. But it means that, paleontologists are very interested in working out the size, and in particular the weight, of extinct animals, because it will tell you an enormous amount about them.
And how can you tell that just from a skeleton? Because skeletons they're very thin in general. So I know this has got something to do with femurs, but I can't remember what exactly, why. Okay, I do know. I'm going to stop playing dumb. This is what I know. You measure how thick the femur is, and that might tell you something.
Yeah, so I don't think we mentioned, we did try to record this episode before and then discovered that the recording hadn't worked. So Izzy has had some priming and rehashing.
I don't know how stupid to be.
No comment.
Going by what I can remember, I don't know much. But yeah, it's to do with, you can measure the femur. But why that particular bone? Why not measure the knuckle? I don't know.
So your femur, your thigh bone, is, particularly for bipeds, which of course includes us and all theropods and a fair few other dinosaurs as well, is what's bearing your weight. So when you walk around with a vertical columnar limb, which is what we and dinosaurs have, in other words, it's sitting up straight, it is bearing the weight of the animal through that limb. And therefore is obviously going to have a fairly tight relationship with how heavy you are. It's more than that, of course, because when you're doing things like walking, you're now taking your weight on one limb, not two. And then when, of course, you're running, you're putting even more stress on it. But animals in general tend to have a fairly uniform safety factor. So safety factor is basically a number which indicates how much stronger something is than it needs to be not to break under a certain load. So if you're an animal of weight X and the maximum speed that you could possibly run is Y, we can calculate a force that is going to be on that bone. And most organisms inevitably have a higher number than that. You don't want your limbs to break as soon as you hit the possible maximum load.
That would make the Olympics hilarious.
Yeah. And that is the safety factor. And inevitably, evolution has settled on, I can't remember what the exact value is, but that's going to be fairly uniform because it is going to be rare that organisms will exceed that. You don't want to grow tons and tons of extra bone that you have to lug around that's never going to make any difference, nor do you want to be exactly on the margin. And for most animals, that gap is going to be the same.
I'm very worried now for all those kids who wish to have superpowers and stuff, because ultimately what they're wishing for is a couple of fractured femurs, and that is not good.
Yeah, avoid that if possible.
Don't bound over buildings, kids. It's not going to be good.
But it does mean, for all the variety that you see out there, not just in dinosaurs, in, lizards and frogs and crocodiles and birds and mammals and dinosaurs, those numbers are fairly well constrained. And therefore, if you measure the diameter or circumference of the femur, it is a pretty good proxy for the mass. There is obviously variation out there. A less good proxy, one that I've used, is the length of the femur, because that tends to scale with size. That's been really criticised by a bunch of paleontologists, and I'm going to slightly soapbox now, and they go, oh, it's an absolutely terrible measure, or you should never use it. And I don't think that's true. Lots of research has shown it's fine. It's not great by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not wildly out or, constantly giving you very, very poor results. And a lot of the time, the length is a hell of a lot easier to measure than the diameter or the circumference, particularly when you've got all those flattened little things from China. But it means that those various metrics of the femur are give you a pretty good proxy for mass. And I should also say that we've just talked about bipeds. It also is true of quadrupeds. So happily, you can just about scale bipeds and quadrupeds on the same metric. It's not ideal. Obviously, you will always get better and better results if you do one analysis for sauropods and one analysis for ornithischians and one analysis for tyrannosaurs. And even in the ornithischians, you split the ceratopsians up because they're really quite differently built to hadrosaurs, which are quite differently built to stegosaurs.
And there are no dinosaurs which have because I'm thinking of, and I know this is probably wrong, thinking about it a bit more, but shut up, I'm going to say it anyway. But if you look at something like a bison, you're looking at all of its mass appears to be over its front limbs, because that's where it's biggest. It's got this little tiny bum and this huge shoulders with this huge head. Surely the weight's on the forelimbs, not the rear.
Well, there's probably more mass going through the forelimbs in something like that, but that's not really true of most of the dinosaurs, at least. And again,
not even Triceratops?
Probably not, because if you look, their forelimbs as a whole and their front is relatively lightly built, and you've got the lungs in the front half of the chest. That is your lungs are on average about 10% of your volume, and that's all sitting almost exactly between the forelimbs if in something like a ceratopsian. So that's a pretty big gap in just the front half.
That's what happens to me after Christmas. I've just breathed a lot.
Yeah.
That's what
right.
it is.
And heads are often lighter than you think, because you remember there's
mine is.
All that spacing. Well, but things like the sinuses, even in a human, your head is a really heavy bit, but you have a hole behind your nose and behind your eyes, which is, you could just about fit a fist into, which is more or less just a few fragile bits of bone. That's an enormous cavity, which makes it really pretty light, all things considered.
About 8 pounds, isn't it, the human head?
Yeah, something like that.
What film's that from? Anyway.
Can't remember. But the short version is that, yeah, femur is a pretty decent proxy. Various metrics of the femur are a decent, if not amazing, proxy for how heavy something is. And of course, that's really important because with so many dinosaurs, they're very, very fragmentary indeed. And happily, the femur is a big, solid bone, which usually preserves pretty well. So we've got a good set of them. And therefore, that makes it relatively useful for doing analyses of things like the evolution of size.
But what about, because you've mentioned in a previous, either on the questions episode or something, the fatness of bears and the variation of a single individual. So is there any way of telling that about dinosaurs where they got chubby in the winter?
Well, yeah, so that's where the problems start kicking in, of course, because even if you had a perfect, complete skeleton of an animal, and you could measure it in every possible way and compare it to lots of brilliantly complete skeletons and all lots of other things of other closely related species, you're going to come up with a range of numbers, or at least there is going to be a fair amount of error around that number. So yeah, I love this thing about bears. I found a paper ages ago about bears going into hibernation. Of course, when they go into hibernation, they're kind of maximum fatness, and when they come out, they're as thin as they could possibly be, and they've lost a ton of weight. This is obviously unusual. It's not like most animals are doing that, but at least some bears, the point at which they go into hibernation versus the point at which they come out is double.
Wow.
They either double their weight or halve their weight, depending on which end round you're looking at it. But that's quite extraordinary, and when a really big bear is, 500 kilos or something like that, you're talking about A tremendous change in mass every year for a single animal. And then, of course, an adult bear isn't growing.
Of course, because dinosaurs, they don't actually stop, do they?
Well, at least some probably don't, yeah. But
like crocodiles.
Crocodiles at least are definitely doing that. So, yeah, you've got this phenomenon whereby I could take that bear skeleton and I could come up with an estimate of mass of 250 kilos and an estimate of 500, and they would both be correct for that one individual bear, let alone that species of bear as a whole. So you can see why, there are some issues. And you can see it just in people. So Mark Whitten, paleontologist and paleoartist, who's a friend of mine. I'm just using Mark as a reference because we literally had this conversation years and years ago when we were at a conference, I want to say in Munich together. And Mark is almost exactly my height, and he's actually quite similar in build, as in we're both quite broad across the shoulders. It's not like he's super, super skinny.
Buffalo men.
Or anything like that. Well, hardly. But I was a little above what I would prefer to be, but I was not a bear going into hibernation, let's say. And I think we worked out that I was like about 60% heavier than him. And okay, we haven't measured it, but based on just, kind of going back to back, shoulder to shoulder, we're about the same size and shape in terms of our skeleton and build. And yet I'm that much heavier than him because he's really light and I'm pretty chunky. And you're like, okay, that's the problem that we're dealing with. And therefore I get frustrated when, of course, I'm not blaming necessarily scientists for doing analyses like this, but, you will do your femur proxy, say, for whatever way around you do it, and you come out and go, I measured this specimen of Diplodocus or this specimen of Tyrannosaurus, and I say it weighs X. And that's what the algorithm is telling you, or that calculation is telling you. But of course, there's almost certainly some general error in that because we say it's a proxy. It's not like some magical calculation. And then there's the variation of that individual because it might be fat that year or thin that year or whatever. And then on top of that, of course, you've got the rest of the species, which is almost certainly not the exact size and shape of that one individual at that one point in its life when it died.
So just out of interest, just between you and this other paleo-artist man.
Mark.
Mark, yeah. Is it because, do you have denser bone than him, therefore, do you think?
No, I think Mark had very low body fat, and I didn't. Probably with a bit more muscle and probably with a bit more bone. Yeah, but we've just had the Olympics.
Where are you growing this bone? Where are you growing this bone? Because that's the bone you should measure. Are you growing a fat bone somewhere?
Yes, I'm big boned and dense. Just look at the Olympics. You will see people. I wrote a thing about The Guardian for this years ago because the BBC did a thing where you could put in your height and weight and it would tell you of other Olympians who had the same measures of you.
It's always depressing for me, that.
Well, it was, but you would come out with people who looked absurdly different. And of course, they're all human. And of course, the Olympics, the humanity is rather more diverse in lots of ways than most species because we're freed of various selection pressures. And then Olympians are training, which is going to exaggerate certain things or select for certain things. But even so, the fact that you can come out with, I'll pick people the same weight as me and I get, a giant female shot putter and an American basketball player. And of course, they're absurdly different body shapes, but they both have the same weight. Or for the same height, I get people who are marathon runners who are half my weight and then rugby players or something like. I'm trying to think of some of those really big guys, weightlifters who are, massively different. Those are, exaggerated forms, but these are the kind of things that we're talking about. At one level, it all averages out. If you're doing, as I have done and lots of people have done, a big study of size of dinosaurs across, 100 million years, then yeah, it's fine because, some of those measurements you've got or some of those metrics, you're going to estimate them over and some under and some are going to be bang on. But if you want to look at 100 million years, on average, that's probably all going to even out. And if you're seeing a big positive trend or a big negative trend, that's going to be pretty accurate. That's probably not going to be thrown out by all these variables. The problem comes when you see people going, and you do see this an awful lot going, this dinosaur is heavier than this dinosaur. And it's like, we've got one specimen of each. And those estimates are proxies for those single specimens, which could be variable and may not be representative of the species. And that's where the problems really start kicking in.
Okay, so this is where I want to finally get your views on Tyrannosaurs, Sue, all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Tyrannosaurus Rex, Have we got really ridiculously large ones? Have we got tiddly ones? What's your thoughts?
Well, almost certainly. So Sue, the specimen in the Field Museum in Chicago, was forever and a day regarded as the big one. Recently, Scotty, a specimen, I want to say in Saskatchewan, but I can't remember, has been, I was going to say remeasured, but I just don't think anyone had ever looked at it in detail. It's certainly been re-prepared, so they've got a lot more of the bones out and can see a lot more things. And on a bunch of measurements, it's as big as Sue, and on a bunch of others, it's a tiny bit bigger. So I think most people now regard Scotty as probably being bigger than Sue. But again, those are those linear measurements of the skull and various vertebrae and bones.
These are the wrong names for Tyrannosaurus Rex, I'm sorry, but Scotty and Sue, it makes me think of two little poodles. This is not something that can eat you with one chomp.
Yeah, I know. But yeah, that doesn't mean that either of them was necessarily that heavy. And we've got 15, 20-ish good specimens for T-Rexes, several of which are in private collections and haven't been measured very well. The idea that even those two are going to be close to the biggest individuals is, really quite absurd. If you went into just, a football stadium with 50,000 people in it and you lined everyone up and deliberately picked the 20 tallest people in that football stadium, you probably haven't got even the tallest person in that city, let alone the tallest person in the country, let alone the tallest human.
And also over time as well, because if you went back to
you're right.
Rome, they're going to be slightly less big than we are.
And then we got a couple of million years. Looking at, Scotty is probably the biggest T-Rex that we know of. The idea that that's like the limit of T-Rex size is absurd, because of course it isn't. Yeah, you don't get to pick 20 things and then go, oh, it's the biggest one. That's it. Found the edge. It's like, not a chance.
What are the chances are then there's one that was double the size of Scotty? Is that possible?
So that's when it gets harder, and that's when you need to start looking at population structure and growth rate and things like this.
Oh my God.
And that becomes much, much harder to say. I'm actually working on this exact problem with my friend and colleague Jordan Mallon at the moment, so I don't want to say too much about it. But yeah, we're looking at this phenomenon. I mean, the basics is already there, as I say. Animals are going to be much bigger than that. We found a nice data set on alligators as this annual survey that they do in the States, and every year they catch, hundreds of individuals.
Just saying that. You're saying the scientists catch the alligators, not the alligators catch individual humans.
Yes.
Sorry, it sounded a bit...
Every year a bunch of scientists catch hundreds of alligators.
They get bigger every year the more they eat.
And every year they get a couple that are over 4 meters long, or 4 meters plus. So really big individuals that are, a 1 in 200 animal. Now, the record for alligators that's verified, which is a big deal, the word verified, because there's so many, this guy from 1850 said he found this one that was, or saw this one that was. And you're like, we can't take that seriously. The record is just over 4.5, I think, something like that. So, 15 getting on for 20% bigger than an animal that's already a 1 in 200. And as you say, that's the biggest verified one. Humanity has not measured every big alligator ever over the last few million years of their evolution.
Well, no, because they're big and snappy.
Well, right, and we've killed loads and loads of them, often encroached on their habitat and done lots of things which will actually almost certainly shrink them down, and therefore, 1,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, somewhere in a Florida swamp was a much, much bigger alligator mississippiensis, but we don't know that because we haven't found it and we haven't measured it. But yeah, so if a 1 in 100 individual is still only 80% of the size of the record that we know, and the record that we know is almost certainly bigger than that, again, I go back to, if we've only got 20 T-Rex, what are the odds that we're anywhere close to that upper margin? Pretty low.
Is there a way that, is there an ultimate limit? Because there must be, I think, did we talk about this ages ago? We're talking about... some people worked out how fat sauropod could get before it could stop walking. Isn't that right?
That estimate was, we're talking about like the 80s or earlier now, but that estimate was like between 100 and 150 tons. It shows you the degree of uncertainty they already had. At which point, in theory, the bones get so broad and the muscles around the bones get so broad that basically the feet can't move. And at that point, you're probably not a functioning organism anymore. But yeah, what is the mechanics mechanical limit of a biped? We don't know. What things might...
it'd be a fun experiment to try and find out.
Yeah,
and
then that also then feeds back into the issues of linear dimensions versus weight. So, as we've talked about this repeatedly. The big sauropods are very pneumatic. They are absurdly heavy, but they are far lighter than you would expect them to be for their size if you compared them to a mammal, which don't have those pneumatic bones and don't have a lot of those weight-saving devices. So we can, I was going to say, hypothesize that implies that there's some science behind it. You could speculate that, really big T-Rexes are even more pneumatic than the others. In other words, you could get a much, much bigger, in terms of linear dimensions, T-Rex, which isn't that much heavier than something like Sue or Scotty. And so you could push those different limits in different ways. I mean, you're not going to get a 50-ton biped. I don't think that's going to be mechanically viable. The upper estimates for Sue and Scotty are in the realm of 9 tons. I think that's a real upper estimate. I think most people are happier with kind of 6 to 7. But still, again, add 20% to the length. Remember, we were talking about length when I was talking about alligators. So times 20% length and times 20% width and times 20% height. Yeah, you're looking at 10 plus tons easily. And that's starting at a 7-ton estimate. What if they are heavier than we think and they're more at 9? Then, these numbers go up absurdly quickly. And there will be either a mechanical limit where they stop functioning, or there'll be an ecological limit. You can make an animal like that in the zoo if you just fed it and fed it and fed it, but in the wild it has to run around and find food, and it can't get enough food, and then it stops. Actually. Well, yes, true. But right, and we don't know which is going to kick in first. I would imagine, to be honest, it's probably going to be ecological before it's mechanical. But we don't know where those limits are. The biggest biped we've got running around at the moment is an ostrich or a red kangaroo, and I'm struggling to think of anything bigger than that. That's not a great basis for extrapolating to a tyrannosaur.
I don't know. They're sort of hissy, snappy things. That'll do.
I don't know what kangaroos you've encountered.
I have encountered a kangaroo. I prefer wallabies because I want to be a wallaby. This is the question I had in my head because, and it's not strictly related to dinosaurs, but it is related to animal size and the femurs again. And that is, what is animals without femurs like? Well, we could talk about marine reptiles like plesiosaurs, or we could talk about whales, because whales are not going to have a big chunky femur, are they?
No. So as I say, you will always get better analyses if you break what you're doing down to a narrow clade. You could come up with a really good algorithm that only works for tyrannosaurs, say, and it would be okay for a bunch of its near relatives, but ornithomimosaurs are built a bit different. The compsognathids are built a bit different. So it's a tyrannosaur analysis, really. Yeah, obviously, any kind of measurement of the femur or something like that is going to be useless for a whale or a snake or anything like that. And you will have to generate those separately. And I don't know much about them because, curiously enough, I've never had to do mass estimates for snakes.
But what about, cause aren't whale bones quite denser than normal bones?
Yeah, a lot of them are. So this is where you're getting, I guess, away from measuring one thing or measuring a few small restricted things and using that to scale up and flipping it around and trying to accurately measure the whole animal. And that was something that was tried a long time ago. I mean, you go back to the, I want to say mid-70s, but certainly by the early 80s, there'd been 2 or 3 papers published, particularly by a guy called McNeill Alexander, who was British, and Colbert, whose first name escapes me, an American, and they did like Archimedes displacement. They got little models of dinosaurs and dunked them in water and worked out their volume.
I was doing this in the very late 80s, I think, myself in the bathtub.
Yeah, at school, yeah. It's
yeah. No, not at school, just in my own bathtub with my own dinosaurs, just going, right. Oh, look, displacement.
It goes up and down.
Eureka.
Right, but remember, before computing and anything like that, how would you go into a museum and see a skeleton of a T-Rex and work out how heavy it was? Well, I mean, the earliest people were just doing it by eye. I mean, they're just kind of looking at the skeleton, hold your thumb up at arm's length, turn it around a couple of times and go, 10 tons. And there's literally papers like that for things. So Brachiosaurus as was, Giraffatitan as it should be now, so the famous specimen from Tanzania that's displayed in the Berlin Museum. There are papers in, I want to say, like the 30s, 40s, 50s, going everything from like 10 tons to 60 or 70 for that animal. And, well, that's just because people looked at it and kind of guessed. And this was at least, doing this volumetric displacement was at least an attempt, I was going to say rigorous, and certainly at least reproducible. And there's some pretty obvious problems with that. So first of all, how accurate is your dinosaur model, let's be frank, toy that you've used?
What?
To dunk into the water.
Very accurate, thank you very much.
Right, so, if you structured the tail wrong or the legs are too, when you've shrunk a T-Rex down to something that's, 15 centimetres long, a small deviation on that model, could end up being a metre cube of flesh, which is, adds a ton to the weight. So that's your first problem. Your second problem is scaling at that scale, basically. Again.
And we're not talking about scales, we're talking about scales.
Yeah, you've shrunk it down that far. If you think that's 1/21st scale, and yet it's actually 1/22nd scale, or even 1/21st.2, again, when you've got a sauropod, you're scaling it up 110 times, and if in fact you should have only scaled it up 108 times, that's going to make a massive difference to that mass estimate. And thirdly, I think it was really underappreciated just how pneumatic a lot of these animals were. So you're going to have that additional problem for the Saurisians, and particularly the sauropods.
And just to remind everyone, pneumatic means lots of air in the bone.
Yeah.
Just in case you're wondering what we're talking about, just going, they have colds. No.
Yeah. So Colbert and Alexander were doing this stuff, and they came up with some numbers, which in some ways actually are not bad. When I'm not trying to be ungenerous, but when you consider all these massive error problems that they're going to have, they came up with some values which just about hold up as plausible today, which is pretty good, all things considered. But obviously what we've mostly done is really tried to refine that process by being much more rigorous about what is the volume of that animal, just how do we go from bones to a whole animal, where do the muscles go, how big are the muscles, we understand the density of bones, we understand the volume of lungs, we understand the volume and size of air sacs and things like this. My friend Don Henderson in Canada has done stuff where he's even looked at things like, there's differential density on keratin, which for big things covering stuff like the plates on the back of a stegosaurus or on the horns of triceratops, there's quite a lot of keratin there. Let's model that differently. There is bone density variation. Let's take that into account, and all of this stuff.
Feathers as well, I suppose.
Yeah.
Even though they're quite light, they're still, if you've got a lot of them,
they can be really pretty heavy. Yeah. And basically trying to factor all of this stuff in and produce very rigorous reconstructions of single individuals. And of course, you can also do that as well by starting off by scanning now you start off by 3D scanning your skeleton and restoring it in the computer, something you just couldn't do in the 70s and 80s. So we can get these really pretty rigorous reconstructions. And there's another...
Sorry, I just want to talk about the sort of 3D scanning and everything else, because you really do build them up layer by layer, don't you? People don't know how you know where the muscles go, because they don't understand about the scarification. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I find that quite interesting.
Well, so with the skeletons, obviously that's improved and improved and improved and improved, and you're now at the point where you can pretty much do it with a mobile phone. You can walk into a museum and walk around a skeleton with your video camera running, take a video, the computer will break down every shot into a frame, so take each frame and turn that into a photo, and then build a 3D model of the whole skeleton based on all those individual frames. And then, here in my computer, I now have, every single bone of the skeleton mounted in 3D space, which of course comes with its own problem if people have mounted them slightly wrong or got spacing wrong or proportions. There was a nice discussion about this just the other day on the SV Powell blog. Stands for Sauropod Vertebra Picture of the Week, where they talk about, the problem of cartilage. Between vertebrae, you have a bit of cartilage. And there's been arguments and discussions in the literature about if this is even present at all in some dinosaurs, and if it is, how thick it is. So you could take a skeleton, again, let's take something big where it's going to have a big effect like Brachiosaurus, and go, okay, there should be 5 centimetres of cartilage between each bone in the vertebral column versus none. Well...
that lengthens it a lot.
Well, right, so you can add like a metre to the length of the body, just the chest cavity, which is like 2.5 metres wide and 2.5 metres deep. So that's a massive amount of animal you've just either bolted on or taken out if you get that measurement or estimate wrong. So, there are these big factors in there at play for this kind of stuff. Remember, on top of all these other uncertainties that we have. But yeah, so that's one factor. And then, things like the muscles. Well, we can look at birds and we can look at crocodiles and other reptiles. We have a very good idea of what blocks of muscle they have where to do what jobs. You actually have marks on big bones that show where they fit. So particularly things like big muscles moving the thighs and moving the arms and elevating the neck. These are really big, heavy muscles. We can see where they go and we can see how big they are. And we can have an idea of, exactly how big they are, their proportions, also just from the sheer size of the animal. So you can do some pretty rigorous reconstructions of, those individual muscles or muscle groups. Things like the air sacs. So we just talked about pneumaticity again. Those sit in discrete groups that only invade certain bones. So if you know certain bones are pneumatic, you can not only get an idea of the bone density of that individual bone, but you go, oh, that bone's been pneumatized. That almost certainly means there's an air sac in the body next to it as well. So we need to take an extra chunk out for that air sac and, build these models.
And this is why I have an image of T-Rex in a swimming pool in a rubber ring, because that's how it would sit thanks to its air sacs.
Yeah, so T-Rex has almost all of its air sacs up front. So you look at the sauropods and the air sacs invade down into the tail and down the body. There are some others that do this, even for the theropods, even some of the early theropods. There's a thing called Aeriosteon, literally air bone, is pretty much how its name translates from Africa, which is an allosaur. Animals that mostly don't have that much pneumaticity compared to some of the later theropods. And yet it's got, like the furcula, the little wishbone, has got air sacs in it. The arms have air sacs in them. All kinds of weird bits of the body that don't normally pneumatize. In Aeriosteon, it's super pneumatic. In T-Rex, the skull, because you've got the sinuses and some other bits, the neck and the back, and then that's about it. So it doesn't go into the pelvis and the hind legs, and it doesn't go into the tail. But some of the other animals it does. And so, T-Rex is kind of much more front light than it looks. And this is the classic problem of getting dinosaur toys, because obviously they're always solid plastic, and therefore the theropods never balance very well unless you really tip them up very upright or put something under their tail, because the model is very front heavy, but the actual living animal would have had all these, not just the lungs, but all these air sacs in the front half of it, and the tail is solid. So the front half is actually about the same weight as the back half, which is why they balance nicely. But it doesn't work when you get a plastic one.
So actually, one of the ones that's hollow, where you can squeeze them and they go, that would be a more accurate T-Rex.
Probably a little more accurate, yeah. So you can do all of these things and produce a potentially very rigorous indeed reconstruction of your dinosaur. Though again, the air sacs are going to be a bit uncertain. Fat in particular is going to be uncertain. Intraspecific variation, yada, yada, yada. They're probably very, very accurate. And they mostly line up pretty well with other things like a much more simple volumetric estimate of mass or measurements of the femur or scaling it to other animals. The problem with them is that they take huge amount of time. And if you want to do an analysis of what happened to dinosaurs over 100 million years, I want to measure 500 dinosaurs. Well, on the one hand, I could measure the length or the circumference of the femur, which still takes time because I've got to dig it all up and check it and yada, yada, yada. On the other hand, I could do this method, which takes me 2 or 3 weeks per individual. Guess which method we go for. So it means you have this kind of disjunct where we have all these proxy estimates for most dinosaurs, and you can then scale across. So we might have a dinosaur that's only known from half a skull, but it's got a close relative, which is almost identical in size, and it's almost certainly identical in shape, because it's a very close relative, and we've got the femur for that. And we go, well, okay, it's 98% of the size of that, so it's probably 98% of the weight.
Is that what you did for the best Tyrannosaur, which is Zhujiang Tyrannus?
That's exactly what we did. So that's a Tyrannosaur named back in 2010. It's hilariously incomplete. We basically have half of the lower jaw and the maxilla, the big bone that makes up like about half the side of the head. That's about all we have. That's not quite true. We've got a bunch of other bones. We're just not 100% sure they go with that skull. But those 2 bones were basically complete. Certainly the tooth row was complete. So we knew we had the first and last tooth. It's a Tyrannosaurine. It is a very close relative and very similar to to T-Rex and Tarbosaurus and a thing from Canada and USA called Daspletosaurus. It's almost certainly very similar shaped and proportioned. We have solid measurements for the maxilla and the dentary and the tooth rows of those animals, and we have rigorous mass estimates for them. So let's just plug it in and see where it comes out. And yeah, it's comparable to a mid-sized Tarbosaurus or an inverted commas relatively small adult Tyrannosaurus. And given that it's one individual, it's pretty reasonable to say it's about the same size as Tarbosaurus and T-Rex. But we don't know. As we said, we might have by sheer chance found one of the smallest Juchang Tyrannos, or we might by sheer chance have found one of the biggest ever. But we probably haven't. We've probably found, we don't know, but we've probably found a fairly average one. And therefore, since it sits in the middle of the Tarbosaurus size range, it's probably pretty much the same size as Tarbosaurus.
This is the difference, I think, that you need to remember, the difference between mean, median and
mode. Yeah.
So if you just took the sample size of the population on the planet and you went for the really average human, you'd be probably ending up in China. It would be a male adult, but young adults, and he would be, about 5'6" or something.
Yeah. Well, and again, factor in adult versus juvenile. So again, our dinosaurs are not even like that. If you took the average human, remember, you're measuring babies who've just been born and billions literally of children. That's going to drag that average down, and yet it won't actually tell you what an average is like. This is the classic problem that we have with, life expectancy. Life expectancy, it's 78, right? But 78-year-olds, their average life expectancy is in their 80s, because once you've got past about 6 months in the Western world, or even about 5 years globally, so many things kill you as a baby or as a young child. And once you've escaped those, you're likely to live a much longer. Right, but that screws things up, because when most people are living to 80s and 90s, but a few people are dying at a couple of years old, you can see how that really drags that average down, and yet that it is very unevenly distributed. So yeah, there's also a huge difference between the average size of the population and the average size of an adult. And again, more confusion and, what exactly is an adult dinosaur? We discussed that problem before. When do you start measuring it? Well, is this one adult enough to be included in our data set? And you get some oddities. So there's I can't remember its nickname, but if you go to the Los Angeles Museum, they have this beautiful mount of 3 Tyrannosaurus Rex in a row. They've got a normal, inverted commas size adult one, a kind of about half-sized one in terms of length, and then a really young one. Now, the big one is, it's like sits in the middle or the lower half of size for known adult T-Rex skeletons. But it's got like one of the inverted commas youngest skeletons. It's like a young teenager. It's still in like the early part of its growth spurt. So if it hadn't keeled over when it did, it's quite possible that give it another 20 years, it would have been an absolute monster. But of course it isn't in our data set because it's dead. And it died when it died, and that's when we measure it. But yeah, that also, adds to this layer of uncertainty.
What would have happened if that T-Rex had made it and graduated through Hogwarts?
Yeah, who knows? I mean, I do have this kind of idle fantasy of, going to a crocodile farm in Australia and getting their half dozen biggest crocodiles and just breeding them together for a couple of generations, and then getting the half dozen biggest hatchlings of them, and then keeping them in a really, really warm environment, giving them a bit of growth hormone and feeding them like mad, and just finding out just how big can we get a crocodile in the next 100 years. And I bet the answer is a lot bigger than anyone that we've found so far.
And this is where we have Dave's, at least it's not lasers on sharks. At least it's not that.
Right, but it's not just an, oh, well, cool, look, it's a 6-7 metre crocodile or whatever. It's like, does the physiology of these animals break down? Do they even work at that size? Do they even have the capacity in their biology in perfect environmental conditions to get to this size? And then what does it mean for them? That's what I'd really ultimately be interested in, apart from obviously the massive ethics violations of doing that, and B, the fact that you probably would, because because crocodiles do have indeterminate growth.
And James Bond would stop you.
It would take you a century to find out, which is, probably beyond my research career at this point to get the answer.
Oh, wow. It also tells you, I suppose, something about the habitat, because if you find a lot of dinosaurs in one area of the same species, which are very large, and a lot of other ones which aren't, that, I suppose it wouldn't really, because the sample size is too small.
Too small, and you don't know what's going on, and you might have some kind of sorting event through flooding or compression. There's that photo, it was doing the rounds again on Twitter a while ago, and it's this photo of an elephant herd, and there's just this giant aerial photo, and it's just full of elephants. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. It's an absurd number. And it's the result of a drought that basically forced all of the region's elephants together and moving in one direction simultaneously. But, we don't know what's going on in the fossil record at that level of detail. You might find one bunch of animals preserved at a waterhole and go, oh, look, actually, we can look at the taphonomy and go, yeah, this was probably a pretty big drought going on at that time. But if you go back to what I was saying at the very start, if all of those elephants turn up at one waterhole, it's the half dozen who are going to get to drink the most, even if they need the most. They're the ones who are most likely to survive. And then eventually they move on to another waterhole and they all keel over. And 50 million years later, the paleontologists find that and go, wow, elephants are absolutely enormous. And it's like, no, we artificially selected the 5 biggest ones from a population of 100,000. And they're the only ones that we found. And therefore we think that that's average. And it's not. It's extraordinarily exceptional. You don't know that hasn't happened. It probably hasn't, but you don't know that it has.
And on the other hand, environment does play an enormous part in the size of animals, not only in temperatures, but like sewer rats are much larger than their non-sewer rat cousins.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, all these factors and pressures are going to be at play from year to year and decade to decade and millennium per millennium. And we're looking back through these tens of millions of years to single individuals or clusters of individuals. And we can go, T-Rex is mostly living in a fairly temperate environment and it's cold in winter and warm in summer. But we don't know that there wasn't some giant burst of summers and that, it had a really good 20 years up till that point and that had really fed it super well. And yet the one we found over the hill is from 50 years earlier, even if it's from the exact same fossil horizon where they'd had a bunch of bad winters in a row, and so it wasn't quite as big. Things like that you might start picking up from the bones, from cutting into the bones and counting the rings and seeing the spacing of them. But of course, all it would tell you is this one grew fast and this one grew slowly. It wouldn't necessarily tell you that that's the subtle environmental shift, because again, between our individuals, some will grow faster and some will grow slower. So putting it all back together is, curiously enough, a bit tricky.
I like the fact that we could look at real life animals, so like alligators, and make assumptions, and that's quite nice.
I mean, this is the wonderful bit of biology. It all gives you this real data to work from, except biology is extraordinarily complicated and you can barely measure anything that doesn't have a whole bunch of other factors putting pressure on it. I mean, look at elephants. We use elephants quite a lot simply because they're the biggest things that we've got. But we also know, we've massively encroached on their populations. We've massively encroached on their ecology. They're almost certainly shrinking because of hunting and poaching, which is artificially taking out the biggest ones and stuff like this. And we know we're not looking at natural populations. People look at elephant populations and distribution and go, wow, let's try and use this to model what like the carrying capacity of the ecosystem is. How many elephants can this ecosystem support? And the answer is almost certainly way more than they are now, because we shot them all and the populations haven't recovered. What we're looking at, even in like the biggest parks like Kruger Park and the Masai Mara Serengeti Park, they're not a natural ecosystem. They've been horribly moved around and changed just in the last couple of 100 years. So whilst you have more elephants there than anywhere else, it's not what a normal elephant ecosystem looks like. And even if it is, it won't have any of the rhinos in it because we shot all of them as well.
Well, now we have a guest coming on who is going to ask a similar question about the humans' impact on potential dinosaurs, and that is the magnificent Spanners. So, Spanners, have you got a question that we'd like to ask Dave about dinosaurs? I mean, are you a fan of dinosaurs in general, or is this, a long-forgotten passion of a 4-year-old, which is often what it is with people?
I credit dinosaurs with ruining Sunday school for me, and that's one of the first things that just made me really, really curious, because these dinosaurs were these massive, gigantic beasts, and you'd think it would come up. That was all that, and the knowledge of like the stars and the universe and the galaxy, that really got me questioning that and set me probably, down a science path. But there's also just this emptiness with dinosaurs, which is they are gone forever. So the more you learn to love them, the more you kind of instantly grieve them. And it's a fascinating topic I know nothing about, but I have to say I've been addicted to terrible lizards since I found it.
Yay! We always like to have addicts on our show. So, do you have a question you would like to ask Dave about dinosaurs?
I would, Dave. So, are you a golfer, Dave?
No, but I'm aware of the sport.
You're aware of golf. So, when you're a terrible golfer, there's something called like a mulligan. So you can have like a do-over if you chin it into the bushes and you go, okay, that was my one for the round. I can tee up again. And everyone goes, all right, just to stop you crying. You go, fine. So what I'm going to do is I would like to give the dinosaurs a mulligan, a do-over for their horrendous amateur mistake of being killed by a giant rock. Yeah. And so if we give them the do-over, but not just go, okay, start again from where you were, let's put them in with like, that movie 10,000 Years BC, where they're like hunting the mammoths. I assume that's entirely accurate.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. I was thinking of A Million Years BC, the Ray Harryhausen one from the 70s. But yes, there's the much more recent one.
Yeah, which I assume is completely accurate. But if we kind of put dinosaurs into early man's territory, so now these dinosaurs are competing with early man. I want to know, in the documentary Jurassic Park, these dinosaurs are formidable and you can't get away from them. So I want to know, what ones do you think humans would have wiped out? Because obviously we wiped out like the mega aardvark and the saber-toothed rabbit, didn't we? We killed all those. Which ones would we farm? Would we have T-Rex burgers? And which ones would be roaming the plains of Africa? That's my question, Dave.
Yeah, so, that's a cool question. At one level, we'd probably kill just about everything. I mean, that is a real pattern of early humans and human history as they spread out of Africa in particular. You see this basically wave of extinction. Lots of mega herbivores and inevitably the carnivores following, even if you didn't kill the carnivores directly. South America and Australia are, particularly good examples. And I know there's certainly a suggestion in the scientific literature, not an expert on early hominids, but there's an idea that the reason in particular you still have things like elephant, rhino, giraffe, and some of the biggest antelope are all in Africa is because they had co-evolved with early humans, but it was those naive species in other continents where humans suddenly turned up and they had never had to deal with this problem before.
Got mugged.
That's why the big stuff is still in Africa, and generally, of course, there's some exceptions. You still have Asian elephants, but generally in other continents, it didn't go so well. So if you follow that same logic, you might expect that dinosaurs outside of Africa would have been in real trouble. And as you say, which ones would still roam Africa? It would be African species which might still hang around.
So it might surprise you to know that I don't know which ones of dinosaurs are African species.
Yeah.
Spinosaurus! It's Dave's favourite.
Yeah, so Spinosaurus is the obvious like most famous one, and that's eating a lot of fish and hanging around rivers. It's being a weird pseudo crocodile. That's something that probably wouldn't threaten people very much. I mean, obviously crocodiles do kill and eat people. A 10-15 meter long Spinosaurus I'm sure would have a good go, but it's probably not that interested compared to a more terrestrial predator. So things like Brachiosaurus, which almost everyone's heard of. There was originally a Brachiosaurus in Tanzania that's now been renamed to a thing called Giraffatitan, but one of the biggest sauropods, long neck, that's actually very tall, that kind of reaches up rather than down with a kind of bumpy head. So again, as we see in, as you say, the documentary, the first Jurassic Park, that, the big giant dinosaur, that is a Brachiosaurus. So you had stuff like that knocking around, 50 plus tons, quite a large one. There's some stegosaurs in Africa, so not Stegosaurus, but its relatives with lots of spines and plates on. They'd probably find. And there's some big carnivores. There's a thing called Carcharodontosaurus, which is hanging around with Spinosaurus, but it's terrestrial. It's nearly T-Rex size. It's a dirty great predator. I'm quite happy with the idea that 5-ton predators would be very interested in humans as a snack. I've seen in a zoo once a lion try to hunt and kill a sparrow. So
So it would be that we're the sparrow.
Yeah, I mean that's possibly a bit extreme, but but again, you got to remember, for every adult that's out there, there's dozens of juveniles. There would be 1 ton young Carcharodontosaurus, and there'd be 200 kilo young Carcharodontosaurus, and then we're really on the menu. We're exactly the right kind of size for them. So I think humans would absolutely be hunted and killed by carnivores on an kind of average basis. Though you're right, humans, even especially now, but even going back to Stone Age technology, we're really good at fending off big carnivores because we are pretty smart. And we can do things like throw stuff, which very few organisms can do. Nothing likes being hurt, and being hurt when you're not even close to the thing that's hurting you is confusing and unpleasant for things like lions.
It's a really unique human trait, being able to throw stuff, because I believe that Neanderthals, who are one of our closest humanoid relatives, they didn't have a throwing arm. Their arms couldn't perform the same sort of motions that humans can. So the fact that we can throw spears is quite a unique human trait.
Well, it's being able to throw well. So, chimps and gorillas will throw things quite happily, but it's a kind of underarm come sidearm thing. They get some power, they get some range and some accuracy.
They don't have the aim.
But compared to our, baseball style thrust or flick or over the shoulder spear launch, they don't have anything like that power.
So I might be wrong here, but I thought that one of humans' early advantages was being able to just run for a long time, and then things would just get tired and go, well, I guess I'm just dead now.
We're really good long distance runners compared to almost anything. Compared to
dinosaurs?
Well, so there's the big problem that you've got, because Tyrannosaurs in particular are really good long distance runners. So we're not the only ones, and they're predatory. Again,
technically they're walkers.
Well, but again, it's the size issue. A big adult T-Rex, 5 to 7 tons. They're pretty quick, actually, in the grand scheme of things. And they're a walker rather than a runner. But again, you look at the young ones. A half length and therefore 1/8 weight T-Rex, an animal that's, let's call it half a ton. They have very long legs proportionally, and they still have all the long distance running adaptations that we see in the adults. So they've got a fair bit more speed to them whilst being very efficient.
Fair, but wolves are pretty fast, and we licked them. Wolves are massive and all teethy and stuff. I reckon we'd have probably won out in the end, wouldn't we? It wouldn't be left mostly with the herbivores.
As I say, I guess it's the difference between if you randomly dropped an early human alongside a young T-Rex, you're in big trouble.
1-on-1, I wasn't saying
right.
death.
But the species, as a whole, we'd be really good at dealing with them. We turn up in groups. Where we do things like throw stuff and dig holes and have fire. These are all things that animals just aren't able to cope with.
And 10,000 BC, we definitely had fire, just saying.
I think we'd be, as a species, perfectly able to cope with big predators like that.
I have a question, which is, we mentioned previously when we were doing an older recording about the terror birds, because we did evolve alongside pretty much reasonably large, scary, flesh-eating dinosaurs.
Oh, I think Force-Arachids are much older than you do.
Do you reckon?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not humans, but humanoid great ape type things.
Ooh,
what do you think? Okay.
I don't know my Force-Arachids very well, but I think they're 15, 20 million years old, and mostly in South America. So
okay, and am I allowed a cheeky follow-up, or is that have I used
cheeky
my time?
Follow-up.
Cheeky follow-up.
Go on.
What dinosaurs would we farm? Are we having Diplodocus burgers?
They're a bit big, aren't they?
We wouldn't eat it all at once, is he? I'm suggesting into small portions.
I think a big problem that you're going to have, or at least the question in terms of answering that I can't solve, is what's the temperament of these animals like?
Yeah.
Because that's something that gets overlooked, or at least it gets subsumed into people's concepts of stuff. So if we're being annoyed by Jurassic Park, and I believe that's a core part of my existence.
Yeah.
So when you get to Jurassic World, so the first of the more recent reboot, there's that one shot where you see, the tourists in little boats and canoes and rafts going down a river, and all these sauropods and other things just happily drinking as they go past. And you're like, okay, it's quite possible you got lucky. But it is impossible to predict the kind of behavior of big animals like that from just fossils. African water buffalo are extraordinarily dangerous animals, and they are big herbivores, and they're aggressive as hell and attack everything and just steamroller and stomp stuff that they don't like, even if it's basically harmless to them.
If you've got a Patreon, haven't you?
Yes.
One of the perks has to be a camera on Dave as he watches Jurassic Park, and just like it's like a yell along. It's not a watch along, is it? And just watch the fuming explosion. I'd sign up to several tiers.
But yeah, so you just don't know. And then, African elephants, yes, they're potentially extremely dangerous animals, but there's a reason that safaris are quite happy to run, guided tours, and you can get pretty close to them on foot because their fundamental temperament is not that aggressive to things that don't pose a threat to them. And you're not going to know that from the dinosaurs. So yeah, there could be some animals which look, I don't know, stegosaurs, there's a good example. They're big and they're spiky and they've got the spiky tail and they had to fend off predators. That doesn't mean they're inherently aggressive animals, and they might actually be really quite docile and very easy to keep. On the other hand, you might have things like ornithomimus or gallimimus, so again, another Jurassic Park reference, the very ostrich-like ones, which aren't that big and don't have giant teeth and giant claws and the rest, but if they really don't like you and they're going to kick and they weigh 2 or 3 times what you do, that would be way more dangerous.
And they lay eggs, right?
Yeah.
So like real big omelettes, like massive dinosaur omelettes.
Yeah, I mean, you get big eggs out of some of the biggest dinosaurs. I mean, well above ostrich sizes. So,
but not as big as you possibly are imagining. So the biggest ones are about that big.
Oh, okay.
Long and thin.
Well, 30, 40 centimetres. So big, but not enormous. Well,
yeah, but that's good at a wedding, isn't it? You got your big frying pan and you drop your dinosaur egg in.
So there's a thing that we don't really know. How many eggs are they laying and how many are they laying in a season? If some of those species are kind of hyper layers, if their ecological strategy is, I'll lay 100 eggs 5 times a year and hope one survives, that would be a brilliant animal to farm because you just take the eggs constantly. Whereas if it lays 20 eggs and it guards them fiercely and attacks anyone who comes near it, that might be a less good option.
Well, now I'm really sad dinosaurs didn't survive. We've missed out on the wedding eggs, the dino zoos, dino safaris.
They did, technically. Yeah. You eat dinosaur eggs every time you make an omelette, technically.
Well, unless you're getting crocodile eggs.
Oh, that's true. Unless you're all shark eggs.
Yeah.
Those little purses.
Yeah, there are other eggs available. Other eggs are available.
Well, thank you very much, Spanners. Remind everybody what your other podcast is if they like the machines.
Oh, that's such a good F1 noise. Mine is... You have to have the Doppler
that just sounds
effect
like
in there.
Cat.
Okay, well, in that case, I will continue with our plug. Missed Apex podcast is an independent Formula One podcast. We have live streams, a live chat room. We have a lot of fun on there, and we've got some of the top media guys. So if you want a podcast with a variety of voices, come and check out Missed Apex podcast. That's not a bad ad on the hoof,
That's very good. That's very good. I'm very impressed. Wait till I go on your one and completely fluff it, going, stop, rawr. You see, there is a man who knows how to plug his show, Dave. That was excellence. You need to learn how to do it. You were on BBC Breakfast, and did you even mention you had a podcast? No.
Oh, well.
Just talking about dragons, honestly.
They asked me about dragons. It's not the same thing.
I suppose, actually, very briefly, it's much easier to measure pterosaur weight because there has to be. They couldn't get to a certain... There's a limit to if you can fly or not.
Sadly, pterosaurs are way, way harder than dinosaurs.
Oh... Why is nothing easy?
Yes. Yes, if only they were solid cubic blocks of steel, then we could measure them quite accurately. Yeah.
Oh well, never mind. Until next week. Rawr. This episode of Terrible Lizards was made possible by our generous patrons on Patreon. To support the show and for bonus content, please go to patreon.com/Terrible Lizards. For links to everything, including merch and past episodes, go to terriblelizards.co.uk. Please follow us both on Twitter. I'm at ISZI_LAWRENCE and Dave is at DAVE_HONE. Send us your questions either via Patreon or terriblelizardspod@gmail.com. If you can't afford to support us on Patreon, please do write a review and recommend the show to your friends. Thank you so much for your support. It means a lot to us.